Good evening, dear friends here in the audience and online. I see large numbers online tonight. Our tonight's speaker, Jenny Webb, needs literally no introduction. Everybody knows everything about her, but I will say a few words to keep up the tradition. More than you know. Jenny, a long-standing friend of Cyprus, is a adjunct professor at La Trobe University, Melbourne. She was elected a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2001, received an Australian Prime Minister's Centenary Award for services to Australian society and the humanities in 2003, and was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2017. Since 2010, she has been editor-in-chief of Studies in Mediterranean Archaeology, together with David Frankel, overseeing more than 45 volumes during that period. Needless to say, many of them on Cypriot archaeology. She's also a member of the Steering Committee of Postgraduate Cypriot Archaeology, POCA, and most recently, in February 2026, she received the Philhellenism Excellence Award at the inaugural UNESCO World Greek Language Day in Victoria, Australia. And this is something I did not know, as Jenny would never speak of her achievements. I am sure that this feels to her as one of her highest accomplishments because of the word Philhellenism in this distinction, which is of course taken to include Cyprus. A few years ago, we claimed her as one of our own, and she is now a professorial research fellow in the Department of History and Archaeology of the University of Cyprus. It is an honor for us to have her among us. Jenny has co-directed and published with David Frankel, Australian Excavations at Marquis, Venia and Politico, and published again with David Frankel, Stuart's Excavation at Carmi in 1961, and Dikios Excavations at Ambelikou in 1942, as well as the pottery and other finds from tombs excavated by Yorgos Georgiou Psematismenos, and the pottery and ground stone from the first 7 seasons of excavations by Luca Bombardieri at Erimi. More recently, she has been working on unpublished material from Lapithos, which will be the subject of her talk tonight. And she's also currently working with Polina Christofi and the Department of Antiquities on material from mid-Bronze Age tombs found during rescue excavations at Lacha. In all, she has published an impressive 26 authored and edited monographs, 72 book chapters, and 68 journal articles, with several more in press. I will finish by highlighting Jenny's huge contribution in 2 fields. First, her concern for the publication of primary data, the material from unpublished excavations and excavation reports. By revisiting material that has been excavated many years ago, but not properly published, and since then almost forgotten, Jenny offers an enormous service to our discipline. And second, Jenny's devotion and commitment to the archaeology of Cyprus, as expressed through her diligence, swiftness, and proficiency in editing the SIMA series, which have become nothing short of legendary. And I will say no more, Jenny. The floor is yours.
I'm just setting my stopwatch so that I don't go too long. Thank you very much, Yorgo, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being online. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak for what should probably be the very last time about Lapithos, a project that I have been living and breathing for the last decade. which is why I'm setting my stopwatch, because I could go on for much longer than I should. I just want to start with some thank yous, because they're really too important to leave until the end. I wanted to begin by thanking Lapithos, who's not here. She's not in Cyprus at the moment, because it was Lapithos that I approached rather nervously at a conference in Stockholm in 2015 to ask if she thought that a project to publish the unpublished tomb material from Lapithos from the 1913 tombs might be conceivable, might be possible. And she encouraged me to think that it would be, and then was enormously helpful as curator during the course of the project. I also, of course, thank Marina Ieronimidou Solomidou, the director at the time, and more recently Yorgos Georgiou, particularly in the case of Yorgos, for entrusting me with the publication of the material from the rescue excavations of 1968-69 at Lapithos Sotira, which added a really important chapter to the project. Eftikir Zakariou, who succeeded Despo as curator, was enormously helpful. Eleni Loizidis and her staff in the conservation laboratory conserved, stabilized all the metal objects which formed such an important part of the story, and the entire staff, of course, of the Apotheki, who not only found material that had been in the storeroom for over 100 years, but kept us supplied with material to process for 2 months every year for, I think, 7 seasons. Vassos Kariolis was also enormously helpful in providing information about what might have happened to this material when he was the director. Robert Merriles, Stella Viacu, who did her PhD at Bryn Mawr on one of the geometric cemeteries that the Americans excavated in 1931. Harry Paraskeva, who helped with the archival material from the 1968-69 excavations. Mr. Neoptolemus Kotsapas from the exiled community, or the exiled council, the council in exile of Lapithos, and his council members who took Stella and I to Lapithos and helped us find the location of the tombs. Andreas Charalambous, thank you, and Maria Dikomitou Eliadou, who did the PXRF analysis of the metal, in the case of Andreas, of the pottery, in the case of Maria, the metal in particular being incredibly important. And of course, I by no means least my amazing team of Kathy, now Dr. Kathy Carriget, Alex, now Dr. Alex Donald, Dr. Catherine Erickson, and some of you will know Catherine's work in Cypriot archaeology, Jean Humbert, and Rudy Frank, who took the photographs that I'll be showing you tonight. And I'd also like to thank the Shelby White Leon Levy Program for Archaeological Publication, which funded the first 3 years of the project. So what I want to do is start by talking about the context or the background of the project, then say something about the project itself and the results of the project, and how, in particular, those results have contributed to a new understanding of the Middle Bronze Age in Cyprus. Lapithos and the North Coast generally have always been important. I'm talking about the Bronze Age. This is equally true of the Neolithic and any other period that you choose. I think of these North Coast sites, Vasilia, Vulmus, Lapithos, Ksephouni, as precocious. If we think of Vasilia in the early Cypriot period with its monumental tombs, its imported calcite vessels, Lapithos also with imports, Vulnus in the early Cypriot period, also with imports, and with this incredibly rich ceramic iconography. Lapithos, which I'll be talking about, Ksephouni in the late Bronze Age. We don't know nearly as much as we would like to know about Ksephouni. The 2 tombs that have been excavated there produced this large boat model, which is on display in the museum. Arguably, there were always things were always different on the North Coast. Things were happening differently to the rest of the island. And I'm reminded of Dikios's comment about Vulnus. He said that Vulnus had revealed a cultural standard higher in every direction than any other early Bronze Age necropolis in Cyprus. I think that's as true today as it was in the 1940s when he wrote that. So why are these communities different? Well, largely because I think they're northward or external facing communities with the great advantage of proximity to the south coast of Anatolia. and the sea lane in between Cyprus and the south coast of Anatolia. These two coastlines are about 65 kilometers apart at the nearest point and in clear visual distance of each other. This is a view of the Kyrenia Range from Anamur, which is at the closest point on the Anatolian coast. But these communities, these settlements were also limited in their potential for settlement growth and density. This is a very narrow plain, it's 5 kilometers wide at the most. And you can see that very clearly from this image on the left here. It's a very well-watered plain, it's agriculturally very rich, but it's bounded by the high wall of the Pentadactylos Range to the south. And it's, in Cypriot terms, it's quite far from the copper ore bodies in the Troodos. So these settlements have both locational advantages and disadvantages. And I wonder whether this interplay may help explain the waxing and waning of central places here. So we have Vasilia in the early Cypriot filial, then we go to, that's replaced, Vasilia is replaced by Vounous, replaced by Lapithos, replaced by Kazaphony, and back to Lapithos in the Iron Age. Certainly, we can see the three centers in the early and middle Bronze Age, these Vasilia, Vounous, and Lapithos, successively making the most of the advantages and able to overcome the disadvantages for at least limited periods of time. The disadvantages being the limited space available in the coastal plain and the distance deterrence to the copper extraction zone. Now, we know that the central north coast played a major role in the development of the Bronze Age in Cyprus, but there have long been two problems. Firstly, we haven't been able to work there since 1974. And secondly, much of the work that was done, particularly at Lapithos, before 1974 was not published. This has had a particular impact on our misunderstanding of the Middle Bronze Age. For example, Paul Östrom, who wrote the volume on the Middle Bronze Age for the Swedish Cyprus expedition, for him it was a transitional period which presents a picture of gradual decline and an initial inspiration which was lost. David Frankel argued for a basic model of an egalitarian society and a relatively isolated island with numerous small independent villages. And John Coleman, the excavator of Middle Bronze Age Alhambra, suggested that the whole population of the island lived in small villages and life was prosperous and peaceful. So the textbook Middle Bronze Age was, until recently, made up of small agricultural villages, egalitarian, peaceful, isolated from the outside world, a period which didn't live up to the promise of the early Bronze Age and contributed nothing to the great and glorious late Bronze Age. This, I would suggest, came about largely because so much of the material excavated on the north coast in the first half of the 20th century, which would have told a different story, was unpublished. There was always a problem with this scenario. If the ancient name of Cyprus was Al-Ashir, then Cyprus was, according to the documentary evidence, exporting copper to Mari and other centers in Syria from at least the late 19th century or early 18th century BC. That is during the latter part of the Middle Bronze Age. And if Cyprus was exporting copper in the Middle Bronze Age, it's most likely that it was doing so from the north coast, because the maritime trade route, which carried raw metals between the Levant and Southeast Anatolia and the Aegean in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, passed between the north coast of Cyprus and the south coast of Anatolia. The north coast of Cyprus may even have been what Stella Domestica has called in a later context a necessary stopover for ships travelling along this route, as ancient ships had to be pulled up on a sandy beach at night, ideally with access to fresh water. Much of the coastline, as you can see of Anatolia, between Antalya and Cilicia, has steep, rugged cliffs, which would not have provided many suitable landing places, while the coastal plain of Cyprus offers far more favourable conditions. I think it might even be possible to argue that one or more communities on the north coast of Cyprus were the local players that enabled this long-distance contact along this part of the maritime corridor. And if there were also outlets for Cypriot copper, they're not just local players, but exchange communities in their own right. And if we are looking for a site on the north coast which could have served as a gateway for a trade in Cypriot copper in the Middle Bronze Age, Lapithos is the obvious candidate. And in terms of our current knowledge, it's the only one. So Lapithos was located on the coast. There are several small bays which could have provided anchorages for ancient ships, one of which has its own spring, one shown with the arrow here. It lies at the foot of Mount Kyparissovono, which is the highest peak in the Kyrenia Range, and serves as a landmark for passing ships. It also has two defensible plateaus at Castros and Aya Anastasia, the only ones on the north coast. So if defense was of any interest to these people, this would have been an ideal place to settle. We don't know where the settlement was, but it was probably on and around, or the settlements, probably on and around these natural fortresses. The only problem for Lapithos and the north coast generally is that the nearest copper ore bodies are some 40 kilometers away. To the southwest, it's Kuriotisa, and at Mathiatis, Cambia, and Shah to the southeast. So if Lapithos was exporting copper, they had to have established a procurement network which stretched south to the villages where mining and processing was taking place, and they had to be able to manage the communication and transport routes between the mining zone and the central north coast. Again, Lapithos is well located in that it, in that it lies midway between the passes through the Kyrenia Range at Agirda and Panagra, which are the only routes south to the ore bodies in the Toros, but this would have required a very high level of managerial ability and a capacity to exert at least ideological, if not physical, control from the north coast to the extraction zone. So this was the context of the project. It's important, of course, to publish old excavations per se. It's important in this instance because Lapithos is in the occupied area. We can't do any new work there. And it's important because Lapithos, and perhaps only Lapithos, can tell us more about the role that Cyprus played in the international metals trade in the first half of the second millennium. Initially, the aim of the project was simply to publish the archival and material evidence to make it available for others to work on, and I'm glad to say that's already happening, but it grew over time into much more than that. And along with the very important work that's being done on middle spirit sites elsewhere on the island, Luca Bombardieri de Rimini, Lindy at Kisoniger, more recent work by Snedden at Alhambra, Maria Rosaria Belgiorno at Pyrgos, the Falconer Falls at Politico. All of this work has given rise to a new view of Cyprus in the Middle Bronze Age. Moving on to the project itself. In 1913, John Myers, Professor of Ancient History at Oxford, was invited by the Cyprus Museum Committee to conduct excavations on the island. They were to be carried out with the help of Menelaos Markides, the first curator of the Cyprus Museum, who had been a student of Myers at Oxford, and the finds were to stay in Cyprus. Myers brought with him a young man called Leonard Halford Dudley Buxton. Who you see here in a portrait by Lafayette, and a picture of him in the old Cyprus Museum courtyard, probably taken by Markides. Buxton had a diploma of physical anthropology. He had also studied archaeology with Myers, and Myers thought he would be useful if they happened to find human burials. They excavated at Levkoniko, at Enkomi, at Lambusa, and while they were working at Lambusa, which is just to the east of Lapithos, they were told about tombs of the early and Middle Bronze Age at Lapithos and decided to investigate those as well. Myers had at this point gone on to work at Kition, so the task of excavating at Lapithos fell to Buxton and Markides. Markides was busy at the museum, so the excavations were in fact directed and recorded entirely by Buxton. Over 4 weeks in November and December 1913, he supervised the excavation of 62 Bronze Age tombs at a locality known as Hrisitubaba, and 4 Iron Age tombs in the hills above the village. That's something like 16 tombs a week. Now, we don't know how many people he had working for him, but in what he calls his day sheets, he recorded the name of the workmen responsible for each tomb, along with his assessment of how good a job they had done. So the excavation of tomb 15 by Xenophon Mikhail was well done. That of tomb 35 by Yorgos Kosti was quite well done. That of tomb 21 by Nicholas Kyriakou was not very well done. And the excavation of tomb 17 by Pandelis Sava and Yanakis Christofi scored a B-, which is very British. There are 27 different names in these day sheets, so we know he had a minimum workforce of at least 27 men, but we know also that's an underestimate because his notes mention that women were also present. Buxton was 24 years old at this point, which is interestingly is exactly the same age that Jim Stewart was when he excavated at Vilnius in 1937-38, and exactly the same age as Erik Stjorkvist when he excavated at Lapithos with the Swedish Cyprus expedition in 1927. And all three of them did an extremely good job, even though we would probably not let a 24-year-old loose on any excavation today. Apart from a season in the Sudan with the Welcome expedition the year before, he had no field experience. He had never been to Cyprus before. He had little or no knowledge of Cypriot pottery and little, if any, modern Greek. And he had at least 30 people digging 10 or 15 tombs at the same time. On top of this, his real interest was in the modern population. Remember, he's a physical anthropologist. So while he was in Cyprus, he took skull measurements and recorded the physical characteristics of over 1,000 living Cypriots, so their hair color, their eye color. He also took photographs, mostly to illustrate his anthropological work, but others show craft activities. He was very interested in crafts. Some of them are views of excavations, unfortunately not of his own excavations at Lapithos, although we know he took photographs. He mentions them in his notes, but I haven't been able to locate those. And portraits. This is a portrait of Myers and a young boy and a Pithos. These are all now in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. You can see them online. They're an incredibly interesting and valuable set of photographs from the early 20th century. He also collected ethnographic material, mostly craft tools, toys, musical instruments, and textiles, which are now in various museums in the UK. He produced several publications in the early 1920s on the modern population, which included the results of his work on the skulls, on 16, I think, skulls from the Middle Bronze Age tombs. He became the first reader in physical anthropology at Oxford, but he died in 1939 at the age of only 49, and sadly has been almost completely forgotten. Or I would go so far as to suggest he's been actively written out of the record. When I was looking at the archival record in the Cyprus Museum, one of the folders that they brought me had a cover page on which was written Buxton's notes from Lapithos 1913, and somebody long ago had crossed out Buxton and written Myers over the top of it. All of the trays were labelled Markides. Even Myers, when in his obituary for Buxton, mentions only that he worked with me in Cyprus in 1913. And yet, so his work at Lapithos is entirely attributed to Myers in both the archival record and the published literature. And yet it is to Buxton that we owe all the information we have on the tombs at Lapithos, in the tombs excavated in 1913 at Lapithos. And I wonder how much information we would have if Myers had actually directed that excavation. The lack of publication has been a really serious problem in the case of Lapithos. Markides returned to the site and dug another 18 tombs in 1917. They were not published. Markides became very ill and had to retire early. The Swedish Cyprus expedition excavated 25 tombs in the same cemetery in 1927. Those were published in SCE1 in 1934. Bert Hodge Hill for the Pennsylvania Museum excavated 39 tombs in 1931. With the exception of one chamber in one tomb, published by Virginia Grace in 1940, they have also not been published. Now we have Ellen Hirsch's 1978 PhD, which is very useful, but hopefully Ellen will formally publish those tombs at some point. And the Department of Antiquities rescue excavated 25 tombs at various localities at Lapithos, including Sotira, which also remained unpublished. So until recently, only 25 or 15% of 168 excavated tombs have been published, or rather fully published. Einar Gerstad, when he came to Cyprus in 1924 to do the research for his PhD, which was published in Studies in Prehistoric Cyprus, he certainly looked at the archival material, although there's no suggestion that he actually looked at the inventories. He does describe many of these tombs in some detail. Myers himself finally wrote up his work in Cyprus in 1913, which was not published until 1946. Remember, there have been 2 world wars in between, and he was active in both of them. But it's quite clear that his description of the Lapithos tombs is entirely based on Gerstadt. He didn't go back to Buxton's notes. His report is described, I think, very aptly by Catling as only a shadow of what it might have been. And had he read Buxton's notes, he would certainly not have said things like, when the number of shafts, most of them rewarded by a tomb, passed 200. That is a complete misunderstanding of the way Buxton numbered the tombs. The first field he worked in, the tombs were numbered 1 to 52. The second field, he started at 101, went through to 108. The third field, he started at 201, went through to 205. There were not over 200 tombs. So it's quite clear that a lot of the corporate memory of the excavation had been entirely lost. Jim Stewart, in his Swedish Cyprus expedition volume, hardly mentions Lapithos at all. He mentions only one tomb because it produced this very nice early white painted vessel. Paul Östrom does deal with these tombs in much more detail, but it's clear that both of them were using Gerstadt's descriptions. Neither of them went back to either Buxton's notes or to the inventories. On top of that, people like Vassilis Karagiorgis pulled out the plank figures and published them in the Choroplastic Volume 1, and some of the more interesting vessels like this circus vase have been published, but none of them with any context. So before I started the project, the accepted view was in fact that it would be impossible to reconstruct the Lapithos tomb groups. Stewart described Lapithos as a cloud on the horizon, mostly unknown and probably unknowable. And Paul Östrom wrote that we are unlikely ever to know much about them since no tomb plans with the finds are available. So clearly neither of them bothered to look for the archival record, because the first thing I was given when I started work in the museum were these 3 red folders, one of them clearly labelled Lapithos plans. So these immediately made it clear that Buxton did draw plans of all the tombs with the finds in situ, and exceptionally, he sketched all the finds. So the record for 1913 consists of 2 interim reports on the excavations, one by Buxton and one by Markides, a more extensive typed report on each tomb by Buxton, his tomb lists, an inventory of the finds compiled by Markides, and Buxton's day sheets, which contain annotated pencil-drawn plans of all the tombs and sketch drawings of the pottery, metal, and other finds. It's really an extraordinary record. And in 1915, Markides arranged for over 60 photographs to be taken of the finds, with the pots in tomb groups and the metal in type groups. Now, these have been enormously valuable, but they've also caused problems because it's always been assumed they were complete groups, whereas they most certainly are not. For example, only 49 of 120 inventoried vessels from Tomb 21 were photographed. So the chronology of this tomb, as assigned by Gerstadt and Östrom from the photographs, is based on less than 50% of the assemblage. As far as the metal goes, in the case of very common objects like daggers or knives, less than half of the inventoried examples, in the case of very common objects, or relatively common objects like axes, most of them made it into the photograph. In the case of in the case of rare objects like axes, most of them made it into the photograph. In the case of common objects like daggers or knives, less than half the inventoried examples were photographed. In the case of the spearheads, it was even fewer. But because these were assumed to be complete groups and no one looked at the inventories, the amount of metal found in 1913 was never fully appreciated. For the tombs excavated in 1917 by Markides, we have annotated plans, inventories, and photos. And for those rescue excavated by the department in 1968 at Sotira, we have plans, sections, and inventories. Not a very extensive written record at all, but because the plans and sections were done by Chryselius Polycarpou, who was an excellent draftsman, I was able to get a lot of information from these. And all of these enabled the full publication of the 3 excavations, so that the number of published tombs from Lapithos is now 124, or 74% of those excavated prior to 1974. The tombs were located in the flat plain between the modern village and the sea. Those excavated in 1913, 1917, 1927, and 1931 were in these fields at Brisi Barba, but Markides tells us that tombs extended for about half a mile beyond the excavated area, over an estimated minimum area of about 10 hectares. The 1968 tombs were located during road construction at Sotira, about 1,000 meters to the east. These are either part of a separate burial ground or the eastern extension of the same burial ground. Some of the tombs excavated in 1931, which were fenced off before the invasion, are still visible in this wooded area. They're rock-cut chamber tombs dug from the base of large rectangular shafts, typically with multiple burials and many grave goods. Tomb 50, being one of the largest, contained over 500 objects. Focusing just on 1913, we have several sets of information. We have Buxton's field notes and plans, in which he recorded 2,062 pottery vessels, 1,050 metal artifacts, and 250 objects of other types. And this is not counting what he refers to on the plans as broken pots or smashed pots, fragments of incised ware, which were not recorded at all. Then we have the inventories, which show what was accessioned by the Cyprus Museum, and we have what we can now, after more than 100 years, locate in the Cyprus Museum. But in effect, 1,360 or 66% of the 2,062 vessels recorded by Buxton were accessioned in 1915, of which 1,101 were located. So 702 vessels identified during excavation never reached the museum. The metal fared better, with 94.2% of the 1,050 artifacts recorded by Buxton accessioned in 1915, but only 414, 39.5% of those were located. And 78.9% of the small finds recorded by Buxton were accessioned, with 53.8% of those located. So what we had to work on was a subset of a subset of a subset. So what happened to the material which was documented by Buxton but not accessioned, and what happened to the material which was accessioned but can no longer be located? We know that some material was left at the site, considered to be broken and useless. We know that some pots, possibly a large number, were given to the landowner, Mr. Demosthenes Severus. Now we know the Severus family were collectors of antiquities. He was either the landowner or possibly the man to whom the landowners owed money. He paid for the excavations in 1917 and he was given pots in return. He almost certainly was also receiving them in 1913. And we know that a lot of objects lost their labels very early on. Gerstad mentions this. You can see that pots have just got little white stickers on them, and the metal had white labels tied on with very fine cotton thread. Those were eaten by insects and disappeared long ago. And material that lost its identity then ended up in the general museum, the museum's general collection. And there may have been one or two other reasons why material never reached the museum. And if I could just indulge in some creative thinking here for a moment. This is tomb 203A. This is my digitization of Buxton's field plan. You will see where the arrow is pointing to an object, it's field number 49, which looks very much like one of these two-headed plank figures, which almost all the plank figures that were found in 1913 were this two-headed type, and they were referred to in the notebooks as ladies. So Buxton says we found 3 ladies in this tomb. This object, field number 49, does not appear. There's no drawing of it in Buxton's notebooks, and it certainly didn't enter the museum. It was not accessioned. So I wonder what happened to it. Then I noticed that in the notebook, this is identified as Lady Gould Adams's tomb, which suggests that maybe Lady Gould Adams was there when he was excavating this tomb. Now, Lady Gould Adams was the wife of the High Commissioner, Sir Hamilton Gould Adams. He was also the chairman of the Museum Committee of Management, being the High Commissioner. They were known to be very interested in antiquities. They were collecting antiquities. Robert Merrilees says that they, in his inimitable way, they were well disposed towards Cypriot antiquity, which means they were collecting. And Sir Harry Luke, who was the private secretary to the High Commissioner, wrote in his autobiography that Sir Hamilton would award himself or grant himself an excavation license, and the 3 of them, Sir Hamilton, and Lady Gould Adams, would go off for the weekend excavating tombs at Pileri, is one site they mentioned specifically. He also says that when Sir Hamilton was you could always tell when he was getting bored in a committee meeting, because he would pull his red handkerchief, his red silk handkerchief out of his jodhpur pocket and start polishing his latest coin acquisition. So I'm wondering, this is a portrait, this is a picture of Lady Gould Adams. When they left Cyprus, they went to Australia, and Sir Hamilton became the governor of Queensland. This is a picture of her taken a little bit later on. And this is a picture of Buxton with a woman who looks awfully like Lady Gould Adams, looking very sheepish. So I don't know what happened to this plank figure, but I wonder if this lady was given to that lady and it found its way to Queensland. So that's, I forgot to say that Lady Gould Adams was actually a young Canadian called Elsie Reardon, who was 24 years younger than her husband, which may also be relevant. So the loss of labels was a major problem. It's been a major problem, particularly for the metal. When I started the project, only 250 of the 1,125 metal objects listed in the inventories could be located. I spent weeks going through the unprovenance metal collection in the museum to see if I could find any of the missing objects using the 1915 photos, and I was able to identify another 200 or so. This is still less than half the original assemblage. But the remaining metal must, I think, all be in the unprovenance collection. We'll never be able to identify it because the objects either have no distinguishing features or because they were not photographed in 1915. So there were lots of challenges, but we did manage to locate, document, draw, and photograph from the 3 excavations a total of 1,689 ceramic objects, 487 metal objects, and 28 other objects. And while this is far from the full assemblage, we do know what is missing because we have the inventories, we have the photos of some of them, and we have Buxton's sketches. So let me turn to the bigger picture. It would appear that the burial ground or grounds at Lapithos were in use for something like 500 years, from about 2200 to about 1700 BC. So we have tombs with early Cypriot 1 to 2 material. We have tombs with early Cypriot 3 to middle Cypriot 1 material. We have tombs with middle Cypriot 2 to middle Cypriot 3 material. Lapithos has always been known for the quality of its clays, and not surprisingly, the tombs produce some very fine pottery. Lapithos was also clearly a centre of production of plank-shaped figures. We have 38 provenanced examples from Lapithos, or 39, if my theory about the one from tomb 203A is correct. There's also a significant amount of pottery from Venia, including tableware, cooking pots, and spindle whorls, which suggests regular movement of people between Lapithos and Venia, and a number of container vessels from the east, from places perhaps like Aios Yakovos, suggesting more commercial transactions. We have some prestigious material from the south, like this picrolite cone-shaped pendant and jasper bead necklace. We have some red-on-blackware from the Karpas, and we can see the influence of this red-on-blackware on some of the local white-painted ware. This is a vessel which copies the shape of one of the red-on-black jugs. And we have a very fine early white-painted cross-line style vessel also from the east of the island. But the most remarkable aspect is undoubtedly the quantity of metal. So in all told, in 140 tombs produced 1,840 metal artifacts. That's 5 times the number recovered at Vunus, and far, far more than any other excavated site on the island. In fact, if we look at the full provenanced published metal assemblage from the whole of the early and middle Bronze Age, and this is, I've been building a database of this material over the last 18 months or so. In the current database, there are 3,288 artifacts across these 12 artifact types. If we look at their provenance, it's clear that the great majority in every single category come from a single site of Lapithos, shown in orange here. Now, of course, there is a problem of archaeological visibility. There are lots of tombs have been excavated at Lapithos, not so many at any other single site except Vunus. But is that enough to explain the dominance of Lapithos in terms of metal? New metal objects, of course, are being found all the time, and they will be published, and I can add them to the database. We have over 260 metal objects, for example, from the rescue excavations at Lachar, and they will certainly shift the numbers. But to read these data only by number is misleading because it assigns equal value to a very small spiral and a much bigger spearhead. So if we were to plot this by weight, I think the story would be different again. but I suspect Lapithos would be even more dominant. So almost half the items from that chart, for example, are these very small spirals or very small beads, whereas the total weight of located metal objects from the 1913 tombs at Lapithos is 30 kilos, and that represents only 39.5% of the total metal assemblage. So the complete assemblage is likely to have been something akin to, or something more like 60 kilos of metal. And it is very likely that there were metallurgical workshops at Lapithos, so that people were producers as well as consumers. So some object types are only found at Lapithos, like these plate pins and these mushroom-headed toggle pins, which towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age, do spread out beyond Lapithos, but for most of the Middle Bronze Age, they're only found at Lapithos. And although we would not expect to find evidence for production in mortuary contexts, we do have some. Tomb 322A, for example, which was excavated by the Swedes, produced a lump of ferrous spice. This is an artificial iron arsenic alloy which can be added to copper to make arsenical copper. Now, this is very likely an import to Cyprus, possibly, as it happens, from Iran, which we know was producing spice and exporting it in the early Bronze Age. And it's relevant to the issue of whether arsenical bronze was produced using copper or naturally high in arsenic like those from the Limassol forest, or by adding arsenic to copper in an alloying operation. We have some lead isotope results from this lump of spice, and they haven't been published, so I'm not going to go into those, but other than to say that the results are very interesting. Also interesting is that this lump of spice was found in that niche in that tomb with 3 gold rings and an imported Minoan razor. This axe from the tomb, from the same tomb, appears to have been used as an anvil. You can see cut marks, which might have been made by a chisel, 2 of which were found in the same tomb. And they could have been used, for example, to cut notches in the shoulders of spearheads or eyelets in toggle pins. That axe has also been used as a hammer, as you can see from the percussion marks on the edge. There are other axes from other tombs which look as though attempts have been made to cut or snap them, or pieces have been broken off as though they were being used as stored metal. So this is indirect evidence for artifact production at Lapithos, but it does usefully speak for the missing settlement record. And we can look at the use of imported tin. So this is Andreas Haralambos' analysis of 415 metal objects from the 1913 and 17 tombs showed 49% to be tin bronze or arsenical tin bronze, with the alloy level set at over 1 weight%. Another 19% contained traces of tin, in other words, they're recycled tin bronze, and there is a significant increase in the presence of tin over time. In fact, the incidence of tin in artifacts from tombs assigned to the Middle Bronze Age is double that assigned to those of the early Middle Bronze Age. We can see this very clearly also in the full analysed assemblage. So all sites, all phases, all analytical methods as captured by the database I mentioned. The tin alloys are almost non-existent before EC3, and they can be shown largely to be imports. They have a minor presence in EC3 MC1, increasing in MC1 to 2, and dominant in MC2 to 3. So tin is embedded in the system by MC2 to 3, at least at Lapithos. But this was not happening evenly across artifact categories. Spearheads show a slight increase in the use of tin bronze in Middle Cypriot 2 to 3, but copper and arsenical copper was always the preferred metal. And that may well be because there's no mechanical advantage to using a tin bronze for a spearhead, and being large objects, they would have required a large amount of tin if they were going to be made of tin bronze. Conversely, among daggers and knives, tin alloys are dominant by MC2 to 3, probably because there is a mechanical advantage to using tin bronze to get a sharp, hard edge. And in the toggle pin assemblage, tin bronze is totally dominant in Middle Cypriot 2 to 3. And that's really interesting because there's no mechanical advantage to using tin bronze for a toggle pin, but there is an aesthetic advantage. More tin, the more the toggle pin looks like it's made of gold. So clearly, metalsmiths at Lapithos at least understood the properties of tin bronze and had sufficient access to tin to be able to direct it toward the production of specific types of artifacts, and in the case of toggle pins, towards socially relevant artifacts. This is an entirely discretionary use of valuable imported tin. and it reminds me of my favourite quote about pins. To see pins as purely practical is to miss the point of pins. The number of imports is also very impressive on the central coast, central north coast generally, but most particularly from Middle Bronze Age tombs at Lapithos. There are some pottery vessels, but otherwise these are primarily metal artifacts and ornaments in copper, bronze, lead, gold, silver, and faience. This table doesn't include a number of unique artifacts from Lapithos, which may also be imports, and it doesn't include these toggle pins, which are identical to contemporary toggle pins from the Levant, in this case from Tel Suba in Syria. These the Cypriot toggle pins here may also be imports or imitations or both. At the end of the day, I don't think it really matters. Either way, they're evidence for connections, close connections with the Levant, and for the imitation of foreign fashions. So a quick word about needles. This is a much maligned artifact type. So for Stuart, Erstrom, Kathleen, Balthazar, needles are a nothing to see here scenario, typeless and timeless. In fact, there are 3 different types of needle at Lapithos. The majority have elongated triangular heads and punched oval eyes. A second, less common type has a long cylindrical head tapering to a rounded top. And a third, very distinctive type has a wrap over head. Now, on these needles, the eye was formed by drawing out the upper part, bending it over and either fastening it to the shaft or inserting it, as you can see with the arrows here, inserting it into a tiny little notch on the shaft. This is a type of needle that was believed not to have reached Cyprus until the late Bronze Age, but here we have it in early Middle Bronze Age tombs. The triangular headed needles appear to be local products, but needles with wrap over heads and those with the long cylindrical heads are likely to be imports or inspired by foreign needle forms. So most needles from Anatolia are of the wrap over head type, and needles with long cylindrical heads appear occasionally in both Anatolia and the Levant. So the humble needle is giving us regional diversity and foreign connections, again on the external facing north coast. They're not the sort of objects that which are likely to have reached the island in the context of international trade or as scrap metal or gift exchange. It's far more likely that they arrived as what I would call incidental or accompanied imports. That is amongst the personal belongings of their owners, possibly specifically with women. So they're a reminder, and for me, this was a reminder I really needed to have, that not all foreign goods reflect the same big picture processes. They're not all related to commercial transactions. These instead suggest at least, I think, small-scale intermittent mobility of individuals between southern Anatolia and the north coast of Cyprus through the early and middle Bronze Age. And that, I think, has significant implications for understanding the degree of familiarity and socialization which may have existed between communities living within visual distance of each other on these 2 coastlines. And I just briefly wanted to show you and thank Rafael Haralambos for pulling out these references for me. These are some references to the way people were interacting between Kyrenia specifically, so the north coast and the south coast of Anatolia, in the 19th and early 20th century. So you can see lots of different kinds of goods are going across that waterway. People are going to the south coast of Anatolia to establish flour mills, to work in the mines. Farmers, if the times are tough in Cyprus on the north coast, they can go and work on the boats until and make enough money. So the access to this waterway and to the south coast of Anatolia are giving people economic opportunities that are not available to other people on the island. I'm not suggesting this was what was happening in the early Middle Bronze Age, but this is an indication of just the possibility of small-scale, intermittent, personal mobility between these 2 coastlines. And then we have a very large number of weapons at Lapithos, particularly spearheads. This is really striking when we compare the number of spearheads from Lapithos with the number from other sites on the island. 60% from Lapithos, almost 70% from the north coast, and no more than a handful from anywhere else. They were being deposited primarily in the Middle Bronze Age, and most Middle Bronze Age tombs at Lapithos contained at least 1 spearhead. The spearhead to minimum number of adult burials ratio in the Middle Bronze Age is 1 to 1.24, and even if we multiply the MNI by 3 to account for unidentified remains, and divide that number by 2 to account for the females, because where we do have evidence they were buried, we do know they were buried with males rather than females. On a per capita basis, the ratio of spearheads to the male burial population would still be 1 to 1.86 in the Middle Bronze Age group. So it doesn't look like people buried with weapons were a small elite group of warriors, but somewhere close to most of the adult male population. We can also see changing attitudes to metal over time at Lapithos. In the earlier tombs, metal objects at Lapithos and elsewhere were placed with the dead and left with them. But by Middle Cypriot 2 to 3 at Lapithos, in the larger and more complex tombs, metal objects were gathered up and placed in groups, perhaps in boxes or bags, apparently no longer viewed as the inalienable possession of particular ancestors, but as a commodity to be accumulated at a corporate level. So this move toward the use of mortuary spaces for the storage of ancestral wealth coincides with other indicators of emerging hierarchy, including investments in tomb size and complexity and access to imported goods, suggesting a significant uptick in the material expression of inequality at Lapithos during the course of the Middle Bronze Age. So, what can we say about Middle Bronze Age Lapithos as a result of all this? It was clearly a large settlement or settlements with a substantial population. The number of imports suggests that it was operating as an entry point for foreign goods and raw materials, including tin and other metals, and very likely to have been involved in the export of Cypriot copper. The large number of weapons suggests that they were able and prepared to defend their economically privileged position, and the concentration of metal and imports in some tombs suggests that metal production and likely also export were being managed by certain groups, and that wealth, access to foreign goods, and social status were in the hands of some families over generations. This clearly suggests that Lapithos was acquiring copper in substantial quantities from ore bodies on the other side of the Pentateuch. It suggests that some people at Lapithos were able to establish a network that linked the central north coast to the mining settlements and managed transport, communication, and security issues over a distance of 35 to 40 kilometres. This must have involved alliances with settlements in the extraction zone like Mbeliku and Katidata, and settlements located on transportation routes and river crossings like Denia and Ayaparaskivin. It may also have involved physical force, with small armed bands at Lapithos playing a part in protecting Lapithos's management of the copper industry. They certainly had what we might call the threat advantage. This would appear also to be the time when the first guard posts were built in the Agirda Pass at Krini and Dikomo on the south, and at Belapais Kapakaya at the north end. The investment in these forts only makes sense if the pass was a crucial route south to the ore bodies, and only Lapithos is likely to have had the manpower, the organisational ability, and the military hardware to build and man them. But the preeminence of Lapithos may not only have been dependent on its capacity to exert force. One class of object likely to have carried significant soft power was moving out from Lapithos within this network. These are the plank figures, which were associated primarily with Lapithos, and lesser numbers with Denia and Ayaparaskivin, and in lesser numbers again with the smaller villages of Maki, Alhambra, Politico, and Mbeliku. This down-the-line movement of valuable objects implies a high degree of connectivity between Lapithos, Denia, and Ayaparaskivin, and sites between these nodes and the ore bodies, and suggests that the North Coast played a significant role in materialising and disseminating symbolic ideas within this network, linking sites ideologically to Lapithos and facilitating cooperation between communities within the network. Lapithos was not the only settlement, the only large settlement in this system. Although again we have only cemeteries, it's clear that Denia and Ayaparaskivin were large population centres. Even at smaller sites, we have increasing evidence for specialised production in the Middle Bronze Age. And in Mbeliku, for example, workshops for smelting, casting, and the production of ingots and the manufacture of pottery. At Irimi, a workshop for the production of woolen textiles. But these were not isolated villages waiting for the Late Bronze Age, but communities targeting particular resources and producing surplus goods for distribution within regional networks. So we now have a very different Middle Bronze Age, a Middle Bronze Age in which some communities were participating in external networks, most notably Lapithos, for whom the sea and the opposing coast of Anatolia offered specific cultural and economic opportunities and exposure to foreign people, goods, and ideas, so not isolated from the outside world. A Middle Bronze Age in which individuals or groups at large settlements had the capacity to set up and manage local networks, possibly in the case of Lapithos with the threat of force. So not all communities were small scale and egalitarian, and this was probably not a time of peace. A Middle Bronze Age in which there was significant expertise in metalworking and the degree of site specialization that this implies, from mining to transport and manufacturing hubs to one or more coastal outlets. So not a period of decline, but of increasing complexity and economic specialization. Not all Cypriots were agro-pastoralists. And in which communities across the island were more diverse and interconnected than envisaged by the isolated village narrative. This is a Middle Bronze Age which can be seen as a true precursor to the Late Bronze Age, a Middle Bronze Age which can credibly be identified as the Alashia of the documentary record, and a Bronze Age in which our external-facing Lapithos played a major role. Thank you very much.
A great deal of applause online, I'm sure, in the room. Judy, that was a truly engaging lecture and a wonderful distraction from the insanity in the recent hours. It was, I mean, you had it all, covered all. I don't know if the crowd has questions, but yeah, I just wanted to congratulate you and well, thank you for taking us through your journey and sharing with us. I mean, we all know the volumes and they're quite voluminous and they were prompt and all very detailed. So we knew what was happening, but it was wonderful to see all your detective work and how you traced everything and how it started and paying tribute to the right people. So that was wonderful and thank you so much. And may I also add that you're setting a very high bar to everyone who's working with legacy material, and I'm sure you're doing the prototype for everyone to follow. So thank you so much for the lecture and for everything.
Thank you.
So I'd like to open the floor for questions to Jenny in relation to her work and process. Yeah, Antula.
Thank you, Jenny. That was amazing. I am not going to ask about the archaeology. I'm actually going to ask about Buxton. And if you have an idea of maybe why he was dismissed from the record, as you said, kind of written over by Myers, was it something that he did later on? Was there any indication of why this person may have been pushed aside?
No, not that I'm aware of. He went on to become the first reader in physical anthropology at Oxford. He worked at Kish, he worked in Malta, he did a lot of work in Oxfordshire with other very well-known anthropologists. So he had a very successful career. I just assume that we're talking about the big man, we're dealing with a big man syndrome, that Myers didn't want to acknowledge anybody as having achieved much under his patronage. But maybe that's me being cynical.
I'm sure you're right. And also, so the plank figurines possibly ending up in Queensland. Are you going to do a bit of detective work?
I have already discussed this with Robert Merrilees, who's the expert at such things, and he doesn't know of any, he can't think of any. And it wouldn't just be the plank figure, it would be all the other things that, I mean, they were collecting, presumably they took with them, I don't know. We also, when Sir Hamilton retired, was about to leave Cyprus to go to Australia, he was given as a gift for his wife by the Cyprus Museum Committee of Management a pair of ancient earrings. So presumably they also went to Queensland. But if Robert Merrilees can't find any record of these, then I don't know that
I was just thinking they haven't been consumed into the Isle of collection. That
I have published the Cypriot material in the Brisbane Museum, and no.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Stella, the Mystica.
Thank you, Jenny. That was a wonderful trip to Lapithos and beyond, and I was really excited to hear and to think about these interconnections between the mainland and the island. And I've always, I've believed and it's documented that these, let's call them strait, this as it was called later, the Silesian Canal, that was a canal. And for sure, the connections were dense. So apart from the boat model of Kazanfani, do we have any other indication, iconography or something else about these maritime communities that for sure they were not of the same character as of the rest of the island because of this particular connection to the mainland? So I wonder how this reflects to all this material that you found.
I think there are possibly other boat models. Bernard would be the expert here, but they're very unclear. One of the wrap overhead needles is very large. It's 21 centimeters long or something like that. And it's the kind of needle that Goldman, when she found them at Tarsus, argued were needles that were used for nets or sails. So, I'm clutching at straws here, but I can't think of anything other than that. I can't think of anything in the iconography. But then the iconography, the Middle Bronze Age it's geometric. It's the pottery decorations.
In the tombs, something that reflects some connections with the sea or it's not. Why?
I can't think of anything.
Why? We don't know.
Well, that's why I think those needles are really interesting, because I think they are telling a different kind of story to the big picture interaction stuff.
But just to pick up on Stella's question, do you envision that there was a sort of koine or some sort of a cultural community that was more linked between the north coast and southern Anatolia rather than, I don't know, the southern part of the island or the east? Or
I think probably I am thinking along those lines now. I mean, I think these were, when I'm talking about northward facing, external facing communities with that wall of the Pentadactylos behind them. Now they're obviously interacting with the mining, so it's not
right.
But and then these people knew they were on an island. They were seeing ships going, presumably ships going past people. They were familiar with the external, with the other, in a way that the poor people who lived at Marquis, for example, would have had no idea they were on an island. They're part of the network. I think they're part of the same network for this procurement network. But I think it is really interesting to think about how people's everyday experience would have been very different, right, according to what parts of the island you came from, how big the settlement was, what the history of the settlement was. And these North Coast settlements are really, I think, doing different things right the way through, probably all the way throughout whatever period we're talking about. So I think, yes, this has been quite, it's making me think about Raphael's those extracts that Raphael pulled out. And people, I think, were talking. Somebody said they would go shopping in Mersin or somewhere because it was about the same distance as it was to go to Larnaca. I don't quite know why they would go to Larnaca to shop, but so it's an entirely different mindset.
Yes, because we're thinking in modern terms and it's a bit difficult for us to grasp, but it's very refreshing and you're absolutely right. In the same way that we consider Engelme with Ugarit, for example, which was something closer than other parts of the island, I'm thinking in later periods, and I'm sure in other phases. So that's extraordinary. Yeah.
So Jenny, what about the settlement? Where do you think, what do you think it would have looked like? Probably not something like Marquis or Alhambra. And where would it most possibly be, higher on the mountain or closer to the coast?
Catling, when he surveyed that area, did identify a number of possible settlement sites, including ones that are near near the current village and in between the village and the sea. So there could have been numerous settlements, or more than one settlement. I just don't know. And it's extraordinary that we don't know where it is, given the amount of development. I'm assuming it would have been in and around those acropolises, but I don't have any more information than that. And I'm assuming it would have been a large settlement or a number of settlements. Whether or not there was a separate settlement associated with the Sotira burial ground, it's a possibility. I don't know. But I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have looked like Marquis or Alhambra or Politico or Erimi. So the settlements at Ayabraskavi, at Venya, at Lapithos, all would have been large, much more socially complex. Yeah.
Yeah, Raphael and then Lindy. Sorry, Linda. Sorry, Linda, you're very timid and I didn't want to go first there. Sorry, and you have tons of congratulatory messages in the chat, and I hope I'm not missing any questions, but we'll come to that. Yes, Raphael, please.
Thank you, Jenny. It's amazing. And honestly, because I worked for my PhD with the entire picture, if I didn't have those books, I don't know if I would have made my PhD, to be honest. They were really inspiring and insightful and everything. So I saw the picture, the map, the 1963 map that you had at the beginning, where it has the two cemeteries, essentially. And they're very close to the coast. And if I remember well, it seems that they are much closer compared to Vunus, for example, or Basilia, as far as we know.
Yes.
So these cemeteries, these tombs would have been right at the coast, very close to a port and anchorage, more or less. So there would have been the first thing somebody sees as it is coming in. And they're also loaded with all these riches and stuff. So do you think they were visible for the people, the tombs, they were marked and they were visible for the people coming in and out? And how could they, well, I guess with all those spearheads and stuff, but also how can you control all the wealth in these tombs if we consider them wealth, if they're so open to the public somehow, so close to the sea and so far away from the cemetery?
Okay, good questions, and thank you for your comment. I'm absolutely delighted. I mean, this has been a huge project. It's been a lot of work, but if it is making a difference, that's fantastic. Yes, they are very close to the sea, and certainly closer than at Vunus and Basilia. And so, if the little cove I was suggesting was an anchorage, and that's where the spring of the old man outlets, then yes, they would have been landing right in the midst of the cemetery. Yes, I think they probably had markers. I haven't found any evidence of them, but maybe they wouldn't have been picked up in the early excavations. We've got markers at Lacha, and I think we had markers at Venya, so stone markers. They could have had markers of wood, of course. Whether the tombs were open, whether they filled in the Thromoy between burials, is something I think we're not very clear about. Why didn't, if you're suggesting why, with all this metal in the tombs, why were they not robbed? I wonder if there was some kind of taboo about going into someone else's tomb, that these were, and so therefore they were actually very good places to keep your wealth. I can't suggest anything other than that. But yes, they would have been between the settlement and the anchorage.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lindy.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Jenny. That was really super interesting. And just sort of thinking about those land routes through the Pentadactylus and into the inland are so difficult, really. And if they were sort of all this local shipping going along in this shipping lane, do you think maybe, I mean, we've got Ambaliku not too far from the coast around to the west. Is it possible that it was the point for local shipping to connect to as well? And can you think of any other sites we might be not thinking about that could serve as little stop-off ports for people to use local shipping?
I certainly think, and I have suggested that the copper from Mbeliku might have been reaching Lapithos by sea. I think one of the advantages of Lapithos, again, is that it had all these options. You could get there through they could use the Panagra Pass. They were halfway between they could use the Kyrenia, the Aguirre Pass, and they could be getting copper by sea. So they're a very strong node within the system in that respect. I would imagine that from Mbeliku there'd been an anchorage at Karabastasi, as there is now. You can see Karabastasi from Mbeliku. It's very close to the coast. As for other anchorages, I guess there could have been.
Wasn't much enough survey done around there.
Before 1974, no.
Yeah. Okay, I'm moving now to there's a lot of comments from the colleagues following online. There's a question by Bleda During, who is wondering whether the spearhead shows signs of wear and use. Okay.
Yes, well, I have written a lot about that. Yes, there are certainly indications of use damage on the spearheads and the other metal artifacts. They were certainly not being made to be put in the tombs. They had all been, all of these metal artifacts had been in use previously. Some of them have been repurposed. The daggers have been rehandled, sharpened. The spearheads certainly have indications of that they were used as spears. They have blunt tips or damage to the edges of the blade. That my work on looking at this has only been based on macroscopic observation. It would be very useful for somebody to do a proper microscopic analysis of this material. That answers your question.
I'm sure it does. And that's probably this. I think it's a comment. And I think she concludes by saying that nobody could have done it better than you, Jenny. Mugi adds the Karmi and the Kamaras were in the north coast, I think, in response to. Yeah.
Oh, the seafarer.
Yeah,
Yes.
I assume. Many other comments. I'm reading Yanis Flolaris, who congratulates you. I don't think there's a question. It's just applauds your ethnographic as well as your archaeological perspective, and that you're bringing historicity to the Middle Bronze Age, and a lot of many appreciative comments of your work, as we all are very appreciative. Any other questions from the live audience or people online? So let us all give our round of thanks to Jenny for her work and her amazing work. You have an announcement? No?
Oh, next week.